This video is brought to you by the Microsoft Virtual Academy. Welcome to the technical overview of the System Center Configuration Manager 2012 Compliance and Settings Management feature. This was formerly known in Configuration Manager 2007 as Desired Configuration Management, or DCM. In this session, we are going to talk about the Compliance and Settings Management vision and how we evolved this from Configuration Manager 2007 to what is now called Settings Management inside Configuration Manager 2012. Part of this discussion will cover the features and improvements that have been achieved between the two versions and how they can now be applied with new and improved ways over what you could do in 07. So let's begin by kind of shaping the vision for what this feature is, and we call it the dark horse in the product because it was this concept in Config Manager 07 that allowed an administrator to define a conceptual model of what an application or an operating system or even an entire configuration of a machine could look like. And effectively what this became was this definition of a list of what we called configuration items, or CIs. And these items could be across one of four categories: application level, operating system, update, or some kind of a general value that you could go and query against anything, WMI, file, registry, whatever. And then we would take a collection of these items, these CIs, and make a baseline. And then we would employ that baseline against a configuration manager environment or a collection of resources. Once that was employed, we would, in fact, at that point, monitor the drift from that desired set of values. And those could be either just one configuration item or a collection of items in an entire baseline. That measurement of drift allowed us to understand what settings were changed or not at the desired setting. And in Config Manager 07, we didn't actually provide the ability to remediate those values without creating what we called query-based collections and then assigning remediation value steps to those collections as mandatory assignments. Well, we've taken that a long step further. And so coming up to Config Manager 2012, our vision for Configuration Manager 2012 Settings Management was to provide a unified platform for customers and partners to define, monitor, enforce, and report configuration compliance in the enterprise for users across all supported Configuration Manager devices. To achieve this, the engineering investments were based around three primary pillars. We had to simplify the administrative experience. We had to embrace the user-centric concept of client management, and we had to integrate architecture and infrastructure and administrative experience for all of these disciplines and for policy evaluation and rule authoring. As any organization began to investigate DCM in Config Manager 07, some of the first pieces of feedback were that it was an incredibly high volume of information. There was a significantly high number of values that had to be monitored and defined, and they weren't simplified in the admin console very well. So we've worked a lot to those pillars, and I think what we'll see here that there's quite an improvement. We begin with two elements that are important values to understand. The first, the kind of core foundation of what settings management is based on, is something called a configuration item. This is defined for OS, applications, settings, rules, applicability, values, configuration settings, etc. We group these CIs into something called a baseline, and then that baseline is deployed against a collection of devices, computers, users, and that deployment is against a collection, basically. Our agent receives these deployments of policy. We discover the CIs, we validate against rules, we remediate and report back. And you can see there on the right side of this slide, there are several ways that the values can be determined. It's Active Directory-based, file, script, SQL, software update status, WMI, XML, etc. You can see quite a long list there of different types of values that we could go and look for on the machine. So really we begin to talk to customers quite at low levels of depth when they talk about what they're employing here, because there really is no limit to what can be determined as a value and a desired setting. So some features and improvements between Configuration Manager 2007 and Configuration Manager 2012 are the following. We have unified compliance settings across servers, desktops, laptops, and even mobile devices. That was the first and foremost information we had to drive towards, was getting a unified view of a setting and how it could be employed, if applicable, across the different targeted systems. We also heavily worked on simplifying the administrative experience. And although the product of Config Manager 2012 itself has a different console experience, so there was already some changes to consider, within the Configuration Manager 2012 console settings management feature, we had to take advantage of other elements like role-based administration, etc. With respect to RBA, there is a compliance settings management role. A compliance officer or compliance manager of some kind could be associated to that role in Config Manager and be given explicit scope of control to some of the configuration compliancy settings that are relevant to the organization. We have abilities now in the administrative experience to browse the gold system when creating CIs. So we could point at a machine, either the local machine we're running from or a remote machine, connect to it and look at things like its registry or some of the different values that are on the machine, and bring those in and create actual CIs around those. This also assisted in simplifying the baseline creation process. So we have a much more intuitive and rich wizard experience to create the baselines that would then be deployed out. And the reuse of settings across CI boundaries to ensure that if we had one CI defined for one collection of resources, we could reuse that based on our SQL backend and our objects being married up in the back. As we've moved along from the past, in Config Manager 07 we called the deployments of applications or other services advertisements. We now call them deployments. And so we now have a more improved process for deploying the baselines. We can deploy the baselines to a user or device, and we can target each of those with specific values or configuration items. And we can define compliance SLAs for the baseline deployments to generate alerts. And so we might want to, as a kind of an anecdotal example, we might want to know about when a baseline falls below 99% compliance. And so it's not the 99% that are compliant we want to worry about, it's the 1% that's going to cause some hot water. And so that's how the SLA alert functionality can be generated inside the console. We've initially called this DCM set. That may be a term you've heard of in the past. But we now provide, either at the CI level, at the specific item value level, or for an entire baseline, the ability to have automatic remediation. Similar to how, if I could explain it in another way, similar to how group policy works, where you have a regular polling of the client and the group policy values are reestablished on the machine as the desired values. That is now exactly how settings management behaves. Now, it's not on by default when you create a CI or a baseline, because there may be some elements that you do want the user to have some ability to change or fluctuate with. But it does have an ability now to simply check off a box at the CI level or for an entire baseline to automatically remediate these values. We control and provide a management model in the console for the revisions of CIs. This becomes very important when we think about things like software updates, because these can be CIs. And we may want to ensure that, similar to how applications talk about supersedence, we want to ensure that we are looking for and evaluating against the most current CI possible. That assists us greatly in what's called change control or change management. And we've also had a lot of feedback from customers that their investments from Configuration Manager 07 need to come across and be migrated. So we do have built-in support for the migration of existing CIs and baselines from Config Manager 07 DCM into Config Manager 2012. So let's talk about the new role-based administration or role-based access control feature and how it applies to settings management. So the scenario is this: we have a built-in role in RBA called the Compliance and Settings Management role. The design principle is very simple. We can view and manage objects that are relevant for compliance and settings management within the console. So what this allows us to do is have an administrator define or populate the role with people that are based in the organization responsible for this. As you can see here, I'm in my Configuration Manager 2012 console. And if I browse down to my security and permissions navigation experience, I have an ability to go and look at first what's called the administrative users. And as this builds on the right side, you'll see a list of who has been added from Active Directory to my administrative users list inside of Config Manager 2012. Once my administrative users are populated into my site environment, I can then assign them security roles. And these roles provide us an ability to assign scope of control based on either predefined or custom-built templates. You can see here I have 3 individuals. And then I have the security roles. Let's browse down and take a look at those. And you can see here, if I highlight it, the Compliance and Settings Manager currently does not have anybody in his role. But if I right-click that and select Properties, this will bring up the property sheet with 3 primary tabs. The one I'll highlight is the Permissions tab. And you can see here that I have a variety of different access control settings based on this role's template. You can see here that there are alerts, collections, configuration items, device enrollment profiles, query site, software update, and status. And you can see down the right side there are different sets of rights and attributes assigned to those values. This is because there are certain elements of the product that this role would not have access to, but there are other elements that they would want to have complete full control, like the alerts level. And so that's the role-based administration, and we have covered that in other sessions here on the MVA site. One of the things we can also do is we can browse on a gold system when creating CIs. The scenario here was simply defined as helping us simplify the process of creating configuration items. There are a few ways today you can do this. There's some third-party partner technology that allows us to do this. We have what's called configuration packs that you can download. And you can also do this, what we now support, which is creating CIs off of the browsing of a gold system. So the screenshot you can see here is we have actually browsed to a machine, a computer, and we've started to look for a particular file, in this case Internet Explorer. And you can see on the very bottom of the screenshot that this file version is greater than or equal to version 8. And this allows us to say that this is the current version of the CI for IE. And it allows the administrator to create this value by just simply looking at the machine as opposed to trying to manually create something. This works for both local and remote file systems and registries. And so it allows us to either look at the box we're running the console from or remotely connecting to a machine for things like file and registry. In addition to those features, let's talk a little bit about now user or device targeting. Our scenario for developing this feature was effectively this: deploy policy to users or devices and remediate and report compliance for those users or devices where the targeting has been established. We did some device targeting in 2007, but the user targeting in 2012 was a little different, and there's more variation, so we had to ensure we were accounting for that. We now use the term deployment. We don't use the word assign of a baseline to a collection, and so consistent with applications now being deployed, we are also deploying these items or baselines. We can deploy these baselines to user or device-based collections, and if deployed to users, evaluation options are as follows. We can evaluate the baseline on all devices when a user logs on, or we can evaluate baselines on only a user's primary machine. And often organizations ask how we determine that, and we actually look at login data, and we can see that Melissa is logging in 98% of the time on that machine. We can see that that is her primary machine. There are some other ways that a primary device can be defined. It can be predefined during an OS deployment. An administrator can manually create that relationship, or we can even have interaction with the user, and they can browse to the software catalog, and we have a tab experience there that says this is, device affinity, and the user can actually say this is my primary device. Configuration items in a baseline can contain both user and device settings. That allows us to have a collection of values that are relevant for maybe a role or a location, and it allows us to be much more simplified in how we're managing our baselines. Some of the user settings that we're going to look for are obviously stored under the HKey current user registry hive, which you could probably expect will be varying quite a bit based on different login experiences. And we have a script setting there, running discovery and remediation scripts under user context. And so that ensures that we're validating correctly and accurately for the user's context under that current user registry settings. CIs, or configuration items that are user-defined or user settings focused, will be evaluated when a user logs on. And so that's one of the most common points the policy refresh happens, and will be continuously done at a low thread priority. So talking about compliance SLAs for baseline deployments, it is very important that when you're trying to achieve compliancy, that we have an ability to accurately report on the compliancy or the drift from a desired state. So our scenario we developed this around was fairly straightforward. We wanted to alert the administrator when a compliance threshold has not been met. And so when we talk about a particular baseline, just to use an example, perhaps we had a security baseline for laptop users, and we wanted to know if the security baseline threshold fell below 98%. That was what the SLA for the organization was defined at. That 2% non-compliance value would initiate an alert in the console for the administrators to then be able to go and drill through and see the reports of who was offending on that and create some very explicit reactions to the situation. So the design principle behind answering this scenario's challenge was to provide clear and alert descriptions and conditions that are not met. Effectively, this was pointing towards the baseline or CI, and it would clearly and concisely allow the administrator to manage the alert properties for the baseline, which was aligned to either software updates or software distribution or another value. The administrator can define those compliance percentages at the baseline deployment level. So as a baseline is created and deployed against a collection of resources, the ability to define a threshold for percentage would be able to be set. It's not on by default, but can be set as a value if desired. The alerts are only generated if that SLA percentage is not met. We can customize the alert properties. There is a variable there we can use. And we can reevaluate alert conditions in time in the future again. So the design goal with this was to allow the administrator to view baseline deployment settings within the console in a richer experience and show the most important issues the admin needs to worry about or prioritize right inside the console without having to go off and look at different logs or things like that. So we've done that in a few different ways. The in-console reporting and compliance stats are quite nice, quite rich. The most common non-compliant errors are sorted based on the number of devices and users impacted. This is a very common way that we could define priority. And we also slice them based on user versus device. And so we might have people who are worrying about systems, might have other people worrying about users, and we can slice the information that way. The reports also now support the ability to show remediation, conflict, or error reporting. And so if we had things like remediation being in place, the reports could even slice and say, well, this is the collection that we're also remediated to get us other trends on what kind of activity is even happening out there. The reporting is very important to consider. One of the most important things for a compliancy officer or a compliancy team in an organization is to be able to accurately report on their compliancy or lack thereof. So we have significantly improved over 07 our reporting, especially with some of the remediation changes we've made. Our reports now let the admin see compliance at a simple glance. You can drill through a CI or baseline and see low-level detail, as well as viewing troubleshooting or remediation information. Here you can see a screenshot of a report called the Summary Compliance of Configuration Items for a Particular Baseline. And you can see here that this baseline is made up of 3 items, and they have versions, they have compliancy status, as well as non-compliancy status. So that's a very basic kind of view there, but with the bottom line here is that we are simplifying the process of viewing your compliancy status in the console by improving the reports that are generated out of the data. So let's spend a couple of minutes and just talk about monitoring drift of configuration settings versus remediation. We still support monitoring. It's the default value. This is how we pursued DCM and Config Manager 07. So we can still, by default, deploy a CI or a baseline and not do any remediation. And so that allows us to just monitor the drift from a desired value. And you can see in brackets here on the top bullet the different values we can monitor: registry key, registry value, file, folder, script, WMI. You pretty much name the value, and as long as we can query it on the machine, we can look for it. We can check the existence or absence of a setting or a collection of settings when we talk about registry values in respect to registry hives, folders, etc. And then we can also check for the value of settings within that. So we can say, not only is it there, but is it there and is it running the correct version? And to go back to a previous slide, we talked about Internet Explorer version 8. We're not only looking there for the presence of that executable, we're also looking for the value as one example of a file. From a remediation perspective, so stepping away from monitoring and talking about remediation, only supported for registry, WMI, and script-based settings, as well as the mobile phone settings that we can provide settings against. We can create a setting if it doesn't exist. So, for example, there may be some kind of a registry value that is required or a file to be present. We can push those down back to the system if we desire that. We can set a value back to a compliant value if it was changed. An example we would share there would be a Windows firewall port being changed, 0 being closed and 1 being open. The firewall port could be set to open based on some application the user installed, and we can just reset that value back to its desired value that we had established in our baseline. We can run remediation scripts, and so we can run a collection of things that potentially would be required to be done if those are the complexities that are required for remediation. And we can also remediate phone settings, and that is our depth management scenario, which is Windows CE, Windows Smartphone based only at this point. Our scenario was fairly straightforward. We had to support configuration compliance on devices. The design principle behind this was a unified platform looking at our marrying or convergence of the mobile device manager technology, as well as the Config Manager 07 device management feature set, and allowing organizations to define and monitor, enforce, as well as report their compliancy status for devices that are supported by Config Manager's depth management. Similar to the PCs and user management CIs. This is fully integrated to author, target, and report on the baseline status or compliancy status. And an improved wizard experience. Compliancy evaluation is offloaded to the server to limit the battery or CPU on the device. We know these are a little less powered, which is changing every day. But in order for us to protect the device experience for the user, we've pulled a lot of the crunching work off of the device, and we're doing it back on the server side. And as I mentioned, this is only for our depth management. Windows Mobile 6.1 and 6.5 are the platforms we support this on. So when we talk about CIs, obviously we've mentioned a few times here in the session that CIs can have a life cycle to them, and they can be superseded or revised by newer versions. And so let's talk for a moment about the revisioning and managing and audit tracking of configuration items. One of the goals of Config 2012 was to support the change management of configuration items. And so as administrators or entire organizations go through the process of changing or updating their configuration settings, we wanted to be able to track that and manage it in a very logical way. So the bottom line for us was creating an ability to see versions of CIs, seeing the history or the backtracking of the different versions that have happened and when. We can see who changed those and what they chose to use, either as specific or latest CIs in the baseline, because we do know that sometimes there could be change management that requires us to pull back a previous version of a CI or a value in a CI. And so creating that audit tracking or that revision history really simplifies the administrative experience of figuring out what happened and who changed what when. So we've had a lot of people talk about and ask questions around the migration of what we called configuration packs in Config Manager 07. And so we had to spend some time supporting the migration efforts to Config Man 2012. And so the result of this is that we have an ability to fully import Config Manager 07 config items, the CIs, and the baselines to Config Manager 2012. We have a tool, a migration tool, that takes you from 07 to Config Manager 2012. And the migration or importing of these points of information will automatically convert the XML schema configuration packs. One of the other biggest questions we have from organizations all over the world is, how do I get the information that I need in there about compliancy settings or values or things of that nature? And so we have these concepts called configuration packs. These are developed by System Center and in conjunction with business groups, first around campus, with other product groups. Think about your SQLs and your SharePoints and Exchanges and Windows, as well as subgroups like Windows Firewall or Defender, etc., Office, for example. And then we also have a partner ecosystem that helps us develop these, and there's a great list of those partners up on the Microsoft market share. Configuration management packs for servers are not updated. These are something we didn't move across as far as the actual config packs. But our solution for this is we will convert the BPA templates to DCM CIs and baselines, and we'll publish them to the Config Manager Pack catalog to make sure they work with 07 and 2012 releases. And so for those of you out there who are using the configuration packs for server, those will be imported and migrated as supported for Config 2012, but they may not be re-released as native config packs on the site. You can see the list of configuration packs available: SQL, Exchange, SharePoint, Windows Server, and then, as I mentioned, some roles within server: IIS, DHCP, and Terminal Server. And you can download these config packs, deploy to your servers, and check compliance. And those were initial points for information that you can begin to bring in configuration settings to be deployed out against your resource lists. So in conclusion, the Configuration Manager 2012 settings management capability provides a unified compliance and settings management coverage across devices, all the devices a user has, such as desktops, laptops, mobile devices, and even servers. Thanks very much for your time. This has been brought to you by the Microsoft Virtual Academy.